It's been a long time. I'm not going to pretend it hasn't, but I'm back. And instead of overthinking this, I figured why can't we just do what this channel was made to do? And that is to make a car. As you can probably see up in the top right corner, it's a little funny actually. This did start out as a tutorial. That was the plan at least. But somewhere in the middle of designing this car, I realized I was going way too deep into the details, doing way too much for a simple tutorial. And at that point I thought, let's just have some fun with this. So that's what this video is. I created this, and while it's not a strict step-by-step tutorial anymore, I will still walk you through the process, explaining my thinking, showing each major step along the way. Hopefully you will enjoy it. I did. And honestly, I've missed this. Welcome back. Anyway, let's get into the design. So now that we're done with that, I'm starting with the body, which is inspired by the Jaguar XJ220, or at least I think it is. I'm pretty sure it is, I'm just pretending to be humble. But at this stage, I'm really not worrying about details yet. I'm basically just molding the body to fit what I think looks good. It's a very scientific approach. I'm adjusting the front, the rear, the roofline, the wheel arches, and the overhangs. Pretty much everything you can think of using the menu on the left. And this is actually something worth pointing out. Instead of only clicking and dragging directly on the body with the mouse, you can open up the morph menu by clicking the little eye icon. From there, you can get access to all the parameters as sliders. This way, you don't accidentally miss any of the morphs, and you have a lot more control over what you're changing. Once I feel like the overall body shape is in a good place, I stop and I fix the stance of the car before moving on to the design details. I find that getting the stance right early on really helps define what I'm trying to do with the shape. I already have a rough idea in my head, and if the base is solid, it becomes much easier to push the design further and get a cleaner, more polished look later on. To fix the stance, you click on the little cogwheel icon here. That enables you to change many different parameters, including where the firewall is, but that's really advanced. What I'm doing is I'm changing where the wheels are, the tire size, and so on. Before we start designing the car, I like to be a little bit transparent about how I make these videos. For anyone new here, I really try to not hide anything or pretend I'm faster or better than I actually am. I like showing the full process even when it gets a bit excessive. For example, this entire section where I'm only working on the front of the car, that's about 24 minutes long in real time. That's important to mention because I do fast forward quite aggressively in these videos. Not because things are done instantly, but because I still want you to have a sense of how long it actually takes. I think it's useful to see both the progress and the time investment when designing a car from scratch. It also gives a better idea of how long the full build really took. So whenever you see a time lapse, just know there's a lot of trial and error and tiny adjustments happening in the background, even if it doesn't always look like it. For me, the design process always starts with the front of the car. Early on, my idea was to make something that felt somewhat period correct. The Jaguar XJ220 is a 90s car, after all. But almost immediately I thought, no, let's not do a straight 90s front end. Instead, I wanted to try something like a retro mod, a very modern front design mixed with some older design cues. So here I'm experimenting quite a lot. At first, I try a very modern looking front end. I think this grill setup comes from a Porsche inspired mod. I also test some more conventional headlights, nothing pop up, just to see how it feels. But then I thought, why not do pop up headlights? The XJ220 actually had pop ups in real life, or actually, they were pop downs. And honestly, we don't see those anymore. Probably for good reasons, but still. This is very early in the process, and I didn't really have the identity of the car figured out yet. I'm mostly just trying to find the right shapes and proportions. My cat is crazy. Anyway, let's continue. Since I didn't really have the identity of the car figured out yet, I'm mostly just trying to find the right shapes and proportions, especially around the openings for the headlights. After a bit of experimenting, I leaned toward a style inspired by cars like the Lamborghini Miura and also the Porsche 928, with those semi covered pop up headlights that sort of rise out of the body instead of flipping straight up. And since I was already using that mod, I noticed it also included those little eyelashes you see on the Miura headlights. At that point, I thought, what do I really have to lose? So I tried it, and surprisingly, it actually worked. It looked interesting, like it belonged there. A bit retro, a bit weird, but in a good way. So I decided to keep it. The headlights themselves originally come from a mod meant for much older cars. So I modernized them, clearer glass, more modern fixtures, and a carbon fiber surround to tie them into the rest of the car. After that, the front still felt a little empty, so I started adding details. My cat is once again crazy. I will deal with her later, but I can't keep that in, bro. After that, the front still felt a little empty, as I said, so I started adding details. I added the logo and then some vents on the bonnet. And you might be wondering why I'm adding vents there in the first place, especially since the engine isn't even in front. The reason is that in real life, a large front grille like this isn't always just for cooling. A lot of the time, it's actually used to generate downforce. Air comes in through the grille and exits through the bonnet, which helps push the front of the car down, kind of like a rear wing, just less obvious. Some of that airflow would also realistically go to things like the AC system and the smaller vents on the left and right. Well, let's pretend those are for brake cooling. I try a few different designs here. The first ones don't really work for me, so I swap them out for something that feels a bit more modern. And then I reshape them to follow the lines that are already on the bonnet. After that, I add a single windshield wiper. A lot of hypercars only use one wiper because of the wide, heavily curved windshield. Koenigsegg is a good example of that. I briefly experiment with adding side vents in front of the wheel arches, but since the front grille is already doing the job for brake cooling, I end up removing them again. It just felt like too much. Then I move on to the roof. I add a subtle double bubble style shape, basically a shallow center channel. That's a tongue twister and a half, but it's basically a shallow center channel that creates an almost M-shaped profile across the roof. This kind of roof sculpting is something you see in cars like the Koenigsegg again, and it helps break up what would otherwise be a very flat surface. It's a small change, but it adds a lot of character to the overall shape. After finishing up the front, I move on to the rear of the car. This entire section is also about 24 minutes in real time. So once again, you're seeing a pretty heavily sped up version of the process. Just like with the front, I try to follow the same overall design principles as in the rear. When I first look at the back of the car, one thing really stands out to me: the distinctive shape of the rear wheel arches. They extend backward and form this almost semicircular shape across the rear, and that immediately gives me an idea. So I decide to lean into that and place large circular rear lights right into the half circle. I felt like that shape was already there, I just needed to emphasize it. Underneath that, the body shape ends quite abruptly, so I try to avoid that harsh cutoff. I add a black trim piece below the lights. I color it the same as the other black trim in the rear, so the shape continues visually across the entire back instead of just stopping suddenly. Even at this early stage, before the taillights are fully finished, the rear already looks much better than where it started. Taillights themselves are chosen deliberately. I wanted something that felt retro but not outdated. At this point, my main inspiration is still the Jaguar XJ 220, but I'm also heavily influenced by the De Tomaso P72, which itself is inspired by classic endurance racers like the Ferrari 330 P3 and P4. I think so, at least. I think they look pretty similar. Those cars have this timeless, almost magical look, very organic shapes, and the P72 does a great job of blending that retro feeling with modern execution. That's the balance I'm aiming for here. By now, I've decided that the front and rear obviously need to match stylistically, but I still want this to feel like a modern interpretation, not a copy of any one car. So I start experimenting more with the rear details. I pick this diffuser element with 5 openings because I think it's a perfect opportunity to place 3 exhaust tips right into those pre-made holes. And honestly, it works really well. As you can see here, the grille shows through the exhaust. So to remove that, I added some modded fixture presets that remove every layer of the car behind it. And then I placed a 3D backing element behind the exhaust so that they look black behind and they thus look functional. And then I add rear daytime running lights, something I also did on the front earlier. I forgot to mention it there, but the idea is the same: realism and consistency. Next, I add a rear diffuser inspired by the XJ220, similar but not identical. I actually flip it upside down because I think it looks better that way. Since the engine is in the back, I also need proper cooling, so I add a small, simple square vent above the exhausts between the taillights. It's subtle, but it fits the design and feels believable. And then I add the logo, the same one I used in the front, to keep things consistent. After that, I add some text, the channel name, Scanian, named after Skåne in southern Sweden. And I also named the car GTR. Since this was originally meant to be a tutorial, I didn't give it a full brand identity, so feel free to leave suggestions in the comments. I genuinely love to hear what you think the car should be called. I experiment a bit with the logo placement, center, offset, different heights, and I eventually settle on this version, which I think works best visually. Then I move up to the rear deck, or the engine cover. Even though the engine sits underneath, the surface still feels a bit empty, so I add a 3-piece design to break it up. At this point, I switch all exterior plastics to carbon fiber, which really helps tighten up the overall look. One of the last details on the rear diffuser is adding more depth. I take another diffuser element and remove everything except the vertical diffuser stakes. using transparent materials, and then I layer those onto the existing diffuser to make it look more complex and purposeful. And I finish it in carbon fiber as well. Now, I don't want this car to look overly aggressive, I want it to be subtle, but still clearly meaning business. So I experiment with different lip spoilers. What I'm looking for here is something small, but also functional looking. It also needs a third brake light, which is required in Europe. Some options look good, but the brake light is too large, others are too aggressive. After a lot of experimenting, I settle on this design, which gives me a carbon fiber center section and a very slim, modern looking third brake light. I adjust the materials, make sure everything lines up properly, and I also set the third brake light to stay on with the DRLs, so it still looks good when the car is just cruising. At this point, you might think the rear is finished, but this is where one of the most important steps happens. I stop and I just look at it, and something feels off. The exhaust grill doesn't quite sit right, so I decide to flip it upside down, and instantly it looks much better. The only problem is that I want the edges of the grill to sit flush with the diffuser. Since they're on the same layer, I have to get a bit creative. I use cutout fixtures, the same I used before, to remove part of the original diffuser, then place the exhaust assembly into that opening. And in the end, it works. Now, the whole rear looks very clean, because there's a curve underneath the headlights that rises towards the logo, creating this really clean, intentional shape that ties the entire rear together. And honestly, I'm really happy with how the rear turned out. There was a clear idea, I followed it through, and it shows in the final result. After finishing the rear, I move on to the side profile, and this section took about 23 minutes in real time. So once again, you're seeing a pretty heavily sped up version of the process. Whenever I start working on the side, I always take a moment to look at both the front and the rear together. I need that full picture before I do anything, because the side is what ties everything together. Looking at the Jaguar XJ 220, it has a very distinctive side profile, largely because of that massive side intake. The same goes for cars like the Tomaso P72. The big side vent really defines the whole car. I wanted to achieve something similar here. But honestly, automation isn't always the strongest tool when it comes to designing side vents. I struggle with them a lot, and I try a lot of different shapes. The first version here actually doesn't look terrible, but in the end, I felt like it was just a bit too aggressive for the direction I was going. So instead, I switched to this side vent design that's clearly inspired by modern McLarens, and honestly, I think it fits really well. At the same time, I add a very aerodynamic door handle to keep the side clean and modern. I spend a lot of time trying to make the side vent flow properly into the front wheel arch, especially this front section here. I want it to look intentional, like it was designed that way from the start, not added as an afterthought. One thing I struggled with for a while is the wing mirrors. That the Tomaso and the Jaguar both have very different mirror designs, and I try a lot of options before settling for these. In the end, these are the ones I like the most. I just tweak them slightly, changing the indicators to amber, like on the front and rear, and making the top section carbon fiber to match the rest of the car. After that, I realize I still need a fuel filler cap. Automation doesn't give you a huge selection here, so I pick one that's similar to the XJ V20 and place it in the roughly same area. Not to copy it, but because it's just a very logical spot. I also add the logo on the B pillar, which I think looks surprisingly well. I briefly experiment with adding additional brake cooling vents towards the rear, but since the rear diffuser is already theoretically handling some of that cooling, at least in our imagination, I decide it's unnecessary and remove them again. Then I add one of those subtle but important details, a small vent at the base of the windshield. Realistically, this would be used for things like the HVAC airflow. At this point, I start going a bit deeper into the details. I add a windshield washer nozzle on the front of the car. You'll never really notice them unless you're looking for them, but that's kind of the point. It's the small things that add up in the end, even if you don't consciously see them. They make the design feel more believable. After that, I think I'm done. But then I realize one small detail. I want to add a radiator. So I make the front grille partially transparent and place the radiator behind it. You barely notice it, but I really like the look of seeing something functional behind the grille instead of just empty space. And once that's done, I take a final look in the car and decide that the side and the details added in this section are finished. But once again, later on when I came back to the project, I realized something important was missing: a rear license plate. And yes, at least here in Sweden, it doesn't matter if you're driving a Bugatti Chiron or a Skoda Felicia. You still need both a front and rear plate. I know that's not the case everywhere, but since I live in Sweden, I like to add both. Call it realism or just me being annoying. Now the license plate in game is pretty large, and realistically you can't just shrink it down to nothing. That would be illegal in real life anyway. But at the same time, whoever owns this car probably isn't that worried about getting tickets. So I experiment with a few placements, and in the end I settle on a centered rear plate. It's subtle, it works, and it doesn't completely ruin the design. Next up, I move on to the wheels and the color, and this section took me about 12 minutes in real time. Before I pick the rims, I first changed the color. Up until now, the car has been in a sort of clay-like color, which is what real-life designers often use in 3D modeling. They literally sculpt the car in clay before moving on to final materials. When I switch it from clay to paint, it immediately goes to a color that looks really good. And funny enough, I can't even tell you exactly what color it is because I'm colorblind. Ironic, right? But it looks amazing. I'd say it's somewhere around a bronze or gold tone. Don't flame me in the comments, please. It's what works. Once the color is set, I move on to rims, which to me can make or break a car. A bad set of rims can ruin even a great design, while a perfect set can elevate the whole car to a next level. I spent a couple of minutes experimenting with different styles, and when I finally find the right set, I set the material to cast alloy, which gives a slightly matte finish that allows me to push for a gold tone, and it looks fantastic. I also adjust the concavity. Front rims are shallower than the rear to emphasize that the rear wheels have more presence, which is especially important since this is a rear-wheel drive car. I make sure the concavity isn't too deep though, because it would distort the circular design details on the rims. That will ruin the aesthetic. Once the wheels are finished, I move on to the brake calipers. I want them to stand out without clashing with the body color. But in the end I go with the red calipers, since that's a safe classic choice. Finally, I adjust the offset of the brakes so that they sit closer to the rims, making them more visible and giving the car a slightly more aggressive look. At this point, I'm really satisfied. The combination of color, rims, and brakes finally makes the car feel complete and intentional from every angle. Once everything else is done, the color, the rims, the front, back, and the sides, I take another long look at the car. I actually step away for a few hours, then come back with fresh eyes. And that's when I notice there is still room for improvement. So I go through the car and change every single carbon piece to forged carbon. Why? Because it just looks 10 times better. It gives the car a more refined, exclusive feel, like someone put in extra time and effort to make every detail perfect. This isn't just a regular sports car. This is a race car disguised for the street. Every choice, every surface, every material is meant to feel intentional, aggressive, and premium, without screaming, "Look at me." And with that, the design is finally complete. At this point, the exterior was finally complete, but now it was time to move on to the interior. I usually don't go too deep into interiors. That's really not my main focus. But this car is special. After a year-long hiatus, I really wanted to honor the viewers who stuck around. And I wanted to make a video that signifies a new era on the channel. So I decided to go all in. I actually spent about an hour on the interior alone, which is about as long as the entire exterior design process combined. I wanted this interior to feel just as intentional and premium as the outside. And first things first, I made the windows transparent using the settings menu, the little cogwheel above the circle on the right. Immediately I noticed that the little roof bulges from the double bubble roof were clipping into the interior in an awkward way. That would have ruined the interior design, so I replaced them with improved pieces, and in the end it actually looked better than before. Next, I laid out the floor of the car using a mod to ensure a proper base before adding details. Then I moved on to the dashboard. Finding one that was both luxurious and functionally appropriate for a race car was tricky. I eventually found a racing style dashboard that fit the A-pillars and roof perfectly. I replaced all carbon parts with forged carbon, matching the exterior and giving the cabin that refined premium feel. And then I decided that the instrument cluster was not good enough. I picked a new modern double cluster design. Next, I added a touchscreen infotainment panel, kind of like a small iPad in the center console. Very modern, very functional. I also placed a rear view mirror on the windshield. A small tip to do this properly is to make the windows opaque when placing mirrors. Otherwise, it's hard to align them properly without clipping. And after that, I focused on the door cards. I wanted something that matched the luxury vibe. They didn't perfectly fit the cabin, so I lowered them slightly to avoid any mesh or gaps being visible from the outside. Then I experimented with materials and found quilted leather with diamond stitching in white, which I paired with black and forged carbon accents. The result, a luxurious high-end interior. I also made the floor mats match, tying the whole cabin together. To add something interesting, I installed a BeamNG compatible screen, and that allows for the car to function in BME Drive, the tachometer and the speedometer will display automatically in game, so that if you export the car to BME Drive, you will see how fast you're going and your RPM. It's actually pretty cool. And then finally, I added the seats. I wanted them to be sporty but still retain the luxury feel. I found some beautiful padded racing seats and added houndstooth material, which gives the interior a little homage to old school fabrics found in classic cars. It accentuates the retro inspirations throughout the design and connects the interior to the overall style of the car. Next, I focused on the steering wheel and interior controls. I started by adding a logo to the center of the wheel, just like many modern cars do. Then I made the wheel slightly smaller. Most sports cars have a smaller steering wheel for quicker and more responsive handling. After that, I updated the materials. The aluminum parts of the wheel were changed to forged carbon, keeping the theme consistent with the rest of the car. For the grip areas, I had initially thought about making the entire wheel white, but realistically, that would get dirty instantly, and it would also make your eyes burn while driving because of all the brightness. Instead, I designed a dual-tone steering wheel, the top and bottom sections in white to match the interior, and the grip areas at the 3 and 9 positions in black Alcantara, giving good grip and a stylish, sporty look. And before working on the center console, I added pedals, gas, brake, and clutch, because I wanted this car to be a manual. Personally, I prefer driving manuals over automatics, so it just felt right. The center console itself was tricky. The original floor had a large driveshaft tunnel, which I flattened to make room. I found a console that fit, but it didn't offer many modification options, so I kept the layout and painted it white, matching the diamond stitched leather used elsewhere in the interior. Once the console was in place, I took another look at the roof. Those ugly body shape extensions that clipped through the interior weren't sitting well visually. To hide them creatively, I added sun visors. I painted them the same diamond stitching, and after a bit of trial and error, I finally got them to sit correctly. The placement is a bit unconventional, but it works perfectly. The visors hide the roof extensions and still make sense because the windshield is so large. It's realistic. After all, when you're driving, you don't want the sun in your eyes, and it keeps the interior clean, intentional, and aesthetically pleasing. With the exterior and interior finished, the final step was the engine. At this point, the engine bay only had a small inline-4 placeholder, enough for basic functionality. I wanted something larger and more exotic to fill the huge space to make the car look complete. I experimented with several configurations. At first, I wanted a V16, but it was simply too large. Instead, I settled on a V12, which is still very exotic. I focused on visual impact over performance realism, since this is about aesthetics. Next, I painted the valve covers to match the car's exterior color. That way, the engine sits in the engine bay and visually integrates with the rest of the car, using the advanced editor. I also raised and moved the engine back, so it would be visible through the rear window. I slightly enlarged it for aesthetic balance, prioritizing visuals over real-world physics. Finally, I wanted the engine to sit in its own compartment, so it didn't look like it was floating. I enclosed the area in forged carbon, giving the engine bay a refined, cohesive look that matches the rest of the car. that, the car is finally complete. Exterior, interior, and engine bay. Everything is intentional, functional looking, and aesthetically cohesive. This took me approximately 2 to 2.5 hours. Just for you guys to understand approximately how long it takes. But the next and the last step is to take a final look, admire it, and capture some beautiful pictures to showcase the car in its full glory. I want to take a step back and talk about it properly, because even though this car looks very thought out and quite detailed, I want to be completely transparent. If we ignore the interior pieces for a moment and only count what's visible from the outside, or rather on the exterior, I actually only used 34 pieces. Overall, including the interior, the entire car comes in at roughly 70 pieces total. That's it. And I think that's a really important takeaway for anyone watching. You don't need an extremely complex or over designed build to make something look good. The car is actually very lightly designed. It's minimalistic, intentional, and restrained. And in real life, minimalistic designs often end up being the most beautiful ones. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the front end is heavily inspired by the Porsche 928, especially with the pop-up headlights, and also the Lamborghini Miura with the little eyelashes. From certain angles, the Porsche influence really shows, and I think that's a good thing. The side profile was much more freestyle. I didn't reference anything specific, I just let the shape guide itself, and I think it kept that clean, minimalistic look without feeling boring. The rear end didn't start out with a clear inspiration either. I mainly focused on creating this subtle M-shaped form using this small piece right here, and you can really tell how important it is. If I remove it, the entire rear just falls apart visually. Put it back in, and suddenly everything works again. The same goes for the diffuser stakes. Without them, the rear looks unfinished. With them, the diffuser suddenly feels intentional and aggressive. It's the small details that often have a very big impact. Now, let's talk about the interior. I think this interior turned out extremely well, especially considering I spent about 1 hour on it, and interior design is not usually my strong side. So, the whole car inside and out, I'm very pleased with how it turned out. That rhymed. And now I want your help. If you have a name you think would fit this car, leave it in the comments. I'd genuinely love to see what you come up with. Next, I'll show you a small slideshow of the final pictures I took of the car. And after that, I think we'll wrap things up for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.